Hello, I'm Maya Bridgewaters. I'm PF Chair for Tempus Debate, and today I'm going to be giving you your January topic analysis. So let's go ahead and get into it. The topic is resolved. The National Security Agency should end its surveillance of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. Sorry. So let's look at the important words of the topic. So what really stands out to me first is U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. So I think this signifies domestic surveillance is of importance. We're not debating, international surveillance as a whole. But that really begs the question, what is domestic? Does correspondence between a U.S. citizen and a foreigner constitute as domestic or international? And really, what is the extent of the surveillance that we're looking at here? So you really have this like question that you're going to have to define and contextualize in round. I don't think it's going to change every single round. I think, we'll kind of find naturally in the community that balance of what this means and what it is. But just be prepared to have that debate and go ahead and be ready to be able to define that for both your opponents and your judge. So just a couple notes on the topic. The first is there going to be a heavy reliance on theoretical arguments. We'll get into this more, but just, kind of on the basis of what the NSA is, it's kind of a secretive organization. We really don't know what it does other than from the Snowden leaks in 2013, and nor does it publish its successes or failures. So we have real no contextualized idea of whether this program is successful or not. We simply do not know, which leads us to be a bit more theoretical rather than concrete with our arguments. So you're pretty much going to find that everything in this round is kind of vague. Second thing I'd like to point out is it's not a legislative thing. If you go back to the resolution, it doesn't talk anything about legislation or Congress or what it is. And so I kind of threw this part from our Tempus debate brief, which is kind of, it's not advocating for federal law to end or stop NSA surveillance, as that would be both untopical and also ineffective, because I can guarantee the NSA would just disobey the law. But as we'll see and as we get more into that. But instead, you should rather argue for whether, the NSA should stop operations on its own. So it's not like for the Medicare for All topic, or I guess even in a sense, the last nuclear topic, we're not arguing for its form of legislation or executive action. We're arguing about whether this program should be working or not. So let's get ahead into more about what is the NSA. So the National Security Agency, or NSA, conducts surveillance on global citizens. However, they mainly focus on communication between American and foreigners. So it was originated in World War II, started by Harry Truman, to decipher codes and different communications of the Axis powers. It became an official body in 1952, however. It expanded more in the Vietnam War, which provided evidence for the Tonkin Gulf incident. And if you know anything about that, I think you'll find that quite ironic. Just because, there is debate about whether the evidence for the Tonkin Gulf incident is accurate. There's a whole book on it. But yeah. Going on further, kind of in the same period, we have the Minaret program, which is a code name that kind of monitored the phone records of different opposing senators, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, prominent U.S. journalists, and government criticizers, specifically people who were against the Vietnam War. So, they collected these phone records, and later in an internal review by the NSA, it concluded that its Minaret program was disreputable, if not outright illegal for that action, which is actually a really interesting thing to look at is, the NSA has this history of doing these, like spying on citizens of the United States, and the internal investigation came out that it was illegal, which means that the NSA itself agrees that the actions it's taking are illegal, yet it believes it still should continue to operate. And it also just demonstrates, the history of the pervasiveness into the privacy of US citizens as well, which I think if you're arguing for the pro is something to really look into and warrant on. I think, the history is a great warrant for that. Um, you know, After all of that, we don't really hear about what the NSA is doing. It's a very secretive organization, of course, until the Snowden leak. So, Edward Snowden was a whistleblower. And if you don't know what a whistleblower is, it's mainly a person high up in US government that will release government secrets in the event that they feel that it's dangerous for the American public to continue or for them not to know this information. It's generally believed as kind of an honorable thing about, hey, here's something that's going on that I cannot tell the government, but I feel like the public needs to know this because it puts the public in danger. So we'll get into more about what this is. So Snowden actually worked for the CIA and then was a private contractor for the NSA for some time. But he became more disillusioned with the programs he was working on. He did not feel that they were at all ethical. So he left the country, went to Hong Kong, met with the reporters from the Washington Post and the Guardian, and fed them documents and links that prove that the NSA was spying on its citizens. We'll get more into specifically later. Um, if you want to know more about what happened, is that while in Hong Kong, the government indicted him for theft and violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. Um, so, he is asked to be extradited to the United States. Instead, he takes a secret flight from Hong Kong to Russia. He stays in the Russian airport for like a whole entire month trying to seek asylum. Meanwhile, comes out as the person is behind these NSA leaks. Um, comes out as the person that's behind these NSA links. Um, Which is, I mean, crazy for the American public to understand. Um, you know, as of now, Russia grants him his asylum. He's not extradited back to the United States against the US's wishes. There was talk of him going to like Ecuador or like Cuba, um, some other like democratic country. Doesn't really happen. As of October 2020, he's now a permanent resident of Russia and he currently works for an upcoming Russian website. So, I mean, kind of interesting, I guess, to see that. I don't know, I found it interesting. Anyway, um, so if you want to learn more about the specific links and the events that led up to us knowing what we're talking about in this topic about what the NSA is doing currently, I feel like this is a really great article to look into. It's a timeline. Again, I kind of have an affinity for timelines, but um, it's a really good piece of information from the original publisher that got the leaks in the first place. They have links to the original articles, which I think are really cool to look back on. So, we talked a lot about the Snowden guy, but what did he actually reveal about what the NSA is doing? A couple of things. First thing we find out is that the NSA issued court orders to get access to phone records and recordings, specifically from Verizon. So that proves that the NSA now has phone records and recordings of every single phone call brought out through Verizon, and they use the courts to do that. We later find out there's another program called PRISM, which gives direct access to data held by Google, Facebook, Apple, and also Microsoft, um, which is also quite concerning because if you think about every single thing you've ever Googled, the personal data and algorithm that Facebook collects, the amount of data and personal information on your Apple phone, including your emergency contacts, like sometimes your credit card information. It's a very surrounding picture of a whole person when they have access to phone records, Google, Facebook, and Apple. Um, there's another program called the Boundless Informant, which keeps record of the data and where it comes from. So there may be a couple arguments that says that the NSA back files are so deep and strenuous to go through that it doesn't actually go through all of them, nor does it keep records of it. Which is, officially what the US government says. Um, is that they're only looking at certain people or they're looking and scanning for certain code words and they only read that. Like it's too much to read for one person, which yes, makes sense. The thing about the boundless informant program means is that it keeps record of all the data and where it comes from, which means that if someone did want to read it, it is there. It's not like lost in this kind of massive soup of stuff. It's very real and present, and it's recorded, time-stamped, everything within a giant computer within the NSA. So the last thing is that US judges signed off on allowing the NSA to make use of information collected from domestic US communications without a warrant. A lot of people feel this is a violation of the Fourth Amendment right, and it's kind of the reasoning and warrant into this during the different law reviews, which we'll get into later, um, about why the NSA and what it's doing isn't exactly legal per se. Again, all of this is very debatable, but we'll continue. So, you know, basically, we see like all these things that were happening, and like not all of them seem pretty sketch. So, how was this allowed to happen? Well, first of all, is the Patriot Act. Following 9/11, Congress rushed a bunch of legislation, a really big document actually called the Patriot Act. It's like 100 pages of measures that are supposed to increase national security. And buried within this large bill of 100 or so pages is um, stuff like what the NSA is doing that, the American public may have not necessarily read. Um, I mean, there's a lot of documentaries on the Patriot Act actually, which are really kind of interesting about, how it was made, how it was passed, how a lot of senators didn't even know what they were signing in the first place. And so that's really interesting. But here's the basics of what the Patriot Act does. So the Patriot Act expanded um, the government ability to tap phones. I know this is applies, it's supposed to say ability, but it also gave agencies more funding towards counterterrorism efforts, increased the ease of intercommunication between agencies to solve counterterrorist efforts. For example, if the NSA picks up on a potential terrorist, they can give that information to the FBI to intersect them. And that's kind of, you find now these domestic US agencies are interconnected and working together to stop these attacks. Um, so you have these increased counterterrorism penalties, but you've also expanded the list of what is considered a terrorism or counterterrorism crime. So where you try to go against a counterterrorism effort, but also, in the broader sense of what terrorism is. In a lot of sense, it's still not defined in both the global and not accurately defined in the US community. It's a very broad definition, oftentimes on purpose. I'm sure you'll run into some of this on like the terrorism arguments in here. Um, and when you look for a definition of terrorism, there's many different kinds. So it's very important to look at what you're looking at and the purview of it in the law. Um, Overall, it increased the right and ability for government surveillance, which gave legitimacy to the practices that the NSA were doing, which allowed them to, in some ways, breach the privacy of US citizens. Which kind of leads us to mainly our pro arguments. So, our first argument is pretty simple. Like, it is very clear the NSA has a history of intrusive surveillance into US citizens and privacy. You can find 40 examples of it. I mean, look back to the 2013 evidence that we kind of just went into and what happened there. It's very evident that there has been in the past breaches of privacy. There's a few impacts here that you could go for. The first is human rights. The United Nations, a lot of international communities define privacy as a human right. When you violate that, you are violating a human right, which is one impact route you can go. Also, you have this idea of it's an erosion of an institution. It's a lack of privacy, not respecting that is what some people say unconstitutional by the Fourth Amendment. There's also different, I mean, that's just the main one. If you go through the law reviews, about the NSA, and you go through, more evidence and looking at, Supreme Court cases that deal in somewhat terms of privacy in Supreme Court cases, and you read those reviews, they go more in depth as to why the NSA is not constitutional, not lawful in the eyes of the United States, goes against the United States core ideals, and the more that we continue that, we allow for the continual erosion of our ideals and we continue to go against them, the harder it is to go back to the original ideals in the first place. And so that's kind of the argument, is that we are eroding that foundation of which the institution is found on, and eventually, the foundation is going to rot to the fact where we're going to have a failing democracy. So I put it asterisk here because if you're impacting out to democracy, I would give you this caveat, is that you have to explain why democracy is good in a tangible way. I know as Americans, we grow up thinking that, democracy is amazing, which I also agree it is, but in a debate round, that is debatable. You're in an educational space where you're trying to be open to every single point of view possible. Some person, I mean, I think it would be ill-advised, could argue that, authoritarianism is a better form of government. Which I mean is not necessarily smart to do, but it could happen. So I would say just give warranting as to why democracy is good. Don't assume that we all think the same thing. That I feel like would be detrimental to your argument. And also, extra warranting never hurts you whatsoever. I can guarantee you, if you further explain why democracy is good, like democracy decreases poverty, democracy, increases human rights, democracy does this, X and Y, it gives you a way better impact than just saying, oh, but it maintains democracy. Um, you also have this idea of global influence, right? The US on the international stage is very powerful. A lot of times, what the US does is what other countries tend to do. So, if the US continues to use this NSA after all this information about how the practices go against our core ideals, or at least it gives legitimacy to these kind of invasive practices of privacy, which could be really dangerous because if you give legitimacy to those practices, that kind of allows other countries to run with it, right? So, a good example of this is, China's own abuses with their internet use. Um, the use of the Great Firewall in China, which is, how China monitors um, the internet, and they search for people looking up things that they don't want to know, or how they filter the internet and lack the use of information, and how they track people within China through the use of AI technology as well, or how they use that AI technology to continue to seek out different minority groups, such as, the Uyghurs or other minority groups in China. Um, is bad, obviously. But giving legitimacy to this kind of like surveillance practice also enables China to do the same, which is really detrimental in terms of not only human rights, but also in terms of just the lives of minorities across the world as well. I mean, it's really not just China. Giving legitimacy to this kind of surveillance and using the internet to track and target people um, is detrimental for almost any single country or any single minority I could possibly think of, um, that could be in danger of from these kind of intrusive practices. Okay, yeah. So next argument is racial profiling. So in this Snowden links, we got access to who the NSA is watching closely. And in these links, you see a clear pattern that is predominantly Muslim, American, Latino, and African Americans. In many sense, they're racially profiling these sources and only looking at these certain people of interest rather than looking for real terms of code words as to potential terrorist attacks. So on the intern level, you can go very basic with this. This isn't really specific to the NSA, but I think it is also a very harmful impact. So racial profiling is harmful. In the larger complex, there's lots of studies and literature that talks about, how racial profiling hurts public health, how the surveillance of these communities actually can be proven to correlating to upping police, um, what is that word? Oh my goodness. Like the number of police in an area, concentration. The number of like police concentration in the area, which of course um, can cause types of police brutality or arguments within that sphere as well. And there's a lot of different, there's impacts on education and poverty and, just so many different things about, the dangers of racial profiling in our society. So that's a potential impact into that. And I think it kind of gives a really good foundation from the NSA because if you look at the national government doing it as well, what does that say for other forms of government or more local forms of government that kind of feed into and feed off of the national government? You can also go with a sense that, this kind of racial profiling is constitutionally wrong. There's lots of cases about, racial segregation or actually a lot of law reviews talk about now racial profiling and the dangers of that and the legality of that as well. And you can definitely make arguments. I feel like arguments have been made before that racial profiling is against the US Constitution and the amendments. And so there again, once again, you have this idea of a corruption of democracy and what you're doing with democracy. Just make sure you explain democracy is good. So more pro arguments. Another one is that the NSA is simply ineffective. In terms of the strength of this argument, I don't think it's very good. I would use it. Actually, you know what? I think it's a very good argument. I don't think I would put it in my case. I think what I would do is I would use it more as a turn. With the caveat, remember not to double turn yourself. So, you don't want to say, hey, like the NSA is not effective at all, and then run racial profiling. And so then they can say, well, if the NSA is not effective, then is it really racially profiling? So that's just, something you have to keep in mind. But here's the basic idea of the argument is that the NSA is not yielding results. It doesn't do anything. There's been lots of false accounts. It's very costly to keep up and gain all of that research and hire people to go through it, right? So there's probably better use from that money. So we can put that into a more productive form of counterterrorism than, working with the NSA itself. So another argument is breaking the internet. So, government surveillance, here's lynching. Government surveillance leads to the distrust of the internet. The companies need the internet to grow. Specifically, these internet companies, which is the majority of our startups in the United States, and which is the majority of the startups in the United States. So this is kind of bad. And in a way, I feel like you can give it a larger magnitude kind of on the world stage as well. Is that these United States companies are kind of what funds the world. Like Google is everywhere, so is Facebook. So it's not just like a United States impact. I mean, even small companies, they kind of grow to be larger. Like the idea of Uber is no longer just in the United States. It's everywhere now. So, you have these ideas. So there's a few impacts. The first is the death of these small companies or lack of innovation. So, if the internet is starting to slow down or there's, not as much investment going into the internet, small companies and aren't interested in innovating and coming up with these new ideas that are mainly founded through the internet. So like you wouldn't see Zoom, for example, you wouldn't see Uber. It's not necessarily only or like Waze before it got bought by Google. It wasn't, which Waze is like a Google Maps kind of app. I should explain that. But like you wouldn't see these waves of new innovative small companies, and it's not just about the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, it's more about these like small companies as well. Another problem with breaking the internet is that if you see the fall of the internet, that's very problematic because the internet is kind of a free flow of information and it really grants education to a lot of people. Education is a form of social mobility. So when you have access to the internet through the internet and thus like social mobility, you also decrease poverty. There's lots of studies into that, about how internet innovation leads to decrease of poverty. It was on a national topics a few years ago, if you want to look through some back files there. Another thing is that, you know, internet is very important towards democracy. The free flow of innovation, you typically get more education, and freedom of thought. And with that kind of philosophy and information available, you typically see democracies rise in those kinds of areas. So you could potentially see an increase in democracy. I know for a fact there's at least one card on it because I remember running this a few years ago and I was looking for a card on it later in my background. I just couldn't find it, but I know for a fact there's a card for it. I remember running it. So if you want to look for that, feel free. Okay, con arguments. So the main con argument that you're probably going to hit every single round is going to be terrorism. So then I say can curb terrorism. Okay, but the thing is about this is that I see a lot of evidence talking about 50 and 56 terrorist attacks were stopped by the NSA. I see 45% of terrorist attacks were stopped by the NSA, and I see absolutely none terrorist attacks can be traced back to, or stopped terrorist attacks can be traced back to the NSA. Obviously, those say three very different things. One says, hey, this is a really successful program. One says, it's about 50-50. And one says it's 0%, has no correlation effect whatsoever. Right. So I would just keep a lookout for that. Make sure you're looking at your methodologies, which statistics make the most sense. If you want an indite, that would probably be best for different cards, I would assume. So there's a lot of different research that should probably go into this. But either way, there's two main warrants into the terrorism argument. The first is that, as you gain this intelligence through the NSA, it allows for the interception and thwarting of plans of terrorism. Thus, you're decreasing the amount of terrorist attacks, saving lives. The other is the idea of deterrence. If you think about it, right? If I'm a terrorist, then I'm probably not going to commit a terrorist attack if I know every single thing I'm doing is being traced by the NSA. It's kind of like a deterrence. It doesn't really incentivize, it disincentivizes me to do something. That said, I feel like there's also the other sort of argument is that if it's disincentivizing me from using the internet, that just forces me to go underground, and then you can't trace me, which is more dangerous. But I feel like that's a bit of a circular argument. I don't know. I'm just telling you that that's probably a pro argument that exists. So to keep that in mind. So I feel like the terrorism argument is also really great because, you have so much impact. So you can talk about domestic terrorism as well. You can magnify that impact and talk about, how, US intelligence is typically shared with other countries. So I feel like you have this path to also stopping global terrorism as well. I believe there's even maybe even possibly evidence I remember reading about how, the NSA could have picked up on the attack in Manchester, the Ariana Grande concert, or was it France as well, those type of terrorist attacks. Um, if we had had the information that we have now, we would have been able to know about it prior. So I don't know. I think there's something to look into and know about. You also have this short term versus long term kind of impact. If you want to talk about current events, short term, you have those attacks that are happening right now. You could also argue that we need to build up our repertoire to combat the next new wave of terrorism, which is supposedly, I'm just going to say this, not putting my opinion out there at all. There's a lot of evidence that says there should be a next wave of terrorism due to right-wing populist movements, and the dangers with that come with that, and kind of how that can potentially lead to white supremacism, um, supremacism, supremacism isn't a word, but I think you know what I mean. Like there's evidence out there that talks about that's the next start of terrorism. So I feel like you could argue that hey, we need to beef up our repertoire to counteract this new threat that's happening. And I mean that threat's not just in the United States at all. Like Eastern Europe has faced that problem for the past couple years. I feel like it is spreading to Russia, China, and so you kind of see that kind of surge happening. Another major argument I feel like, which I feel like is actually really cool to run, would be cyber attacks. The NSA is key to US cyber defense. I feel like that's kind of inherently true with the amount of programs they have that is tracking what's happening on the internet. Um, so I feel like that's a turn almost. Like you're turning their link or like what the pro's trying to say. To get into that, which I feel is like really interesting. And I also feel like it's really interesting because it's a kind of really relevant topic. If you think about, the past couple of hacks that happened in 2016 with the last election, and in December, we've had a couple of recognized cyber attacks from Russia as well. It's becoming more of a key issue to look at and understand. In terms of like warrants, I think you have two. I think you can go with like you talk about cyber attacks from Russia or cyber attacks from China. Both have had recent cyber attacks on US soil in the past few years. And as we know from like the past OCO topics, there's a lot of impacts and they're very dangerous as the effects of like a cyber attack. So you have, the effect on US business, you have power outages, which could kill millions and starvation. I said like there's a card out there that says like a power a, like a power outage in California for like 3 days could kill like 2.8 million people or something. So I mean, that's a really nice internalized impact, which I feel like is really rare on this topic. So something to maybe look into, pull out your back files. So another argument is the Four Eyes argument. Currently, there's agreement between Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. We agreed to converge our intelligence to promote a safer world. So, like, we take our information from the NSA, and we share it with these other countries. They share their information with us. So we have a wealth of knowledge, and with that wealth of knowledge, I think we have a pretty good repertoire for trying to combat these like terrorism efforts that are happening in the world, or just things that are happening like cyber attacks or anything really. However, for this agreement to work, and it only it only stands if everyone puts in their share for work. And obviously, if we don't have the NSA, we're not putting forth the information that we should be, and so it would fall apart, as well as the internal security of other nations, such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. So that would probably be a problem. Another argument, and our final argument for today would be big tech. So, without the NSA, big tech companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, and Facebook now have more freedom to operate and grow. I'm sure there's evidence for this. I've found some cards. Um, I think this is a very nuanced argument, and I don't think there's been a lot of research into it. And I don't know exactly how much core research into the correlation between the NSA and big tech has been. But there's a few cards out there. So I thought I would include it. And as you see the further growth of these big tech companies, you see them beginning to monopolize the market. And here's where you kind of get into the stock argument of like, hey, big tech is bad. It monopolizes the market. It allows for less innovation and less small business, which hurts the US economy. And, innovation is crucial for a multitude of reasons. You can even take it back to like the internet thing I was talking about. Like without small companies and innovation, you wouldn't see like the internet reaching its full potential. I know there's specifically a card about, how innovation has decreased poverty in India by like 8%. So if you want to look into that, that's another argument. Okay, so this is the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, please email us, visit our website. We're really happy to answer your questions. In fact, we have a few more videos coming out about where we'll answer some of your questions you've already asked us. So, once again, thank you for coming. And I hope all of you are doing well.